Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul. I'm just going to walk you through the economic assumptions and employment assumptions as part of the election campaign in terms of the models that both the conservative parties are running, as well as the Liberals and NDP in their statements. And I want to align them with the actual facts. So the first few slides I'll actually walk you through is the GDP and labor rates. So in general, if you're going to measure a country, we measure it by GDP. We measure it by GDP growth. And you're going to hear a lot of comments that Harper's had the lowest growth of GDP of any ruling prime minister. Well, it's easy to look at a high-level number, but you really have to look at the bona fide details that drive GDP. So you don't assume that number that you hear that's floating around by the Liberal Party or the NDP is an accurate number. I would challenge you to go out and look at the economic conditions of the world as well as what's happening within the countries to kind of determine what's really going on. You have to make sure the data is comparable in order to make assessments of that data. The second point I want to show you here is just to show you the labor rates. This is to kind of show you the growth, right? And the other thing is it's also show where the goods producing sector on average pays a pretty good wage, and then the lowest wages are typically in the service sectors in the arts area, and that's all I want you to get out of that graph. Now, one of the things that Canada is out of its control is how economic growth happens around the world. Now, if you look at this chart here, you're seeing worldwide growth that they're expecting in 2015 is 3% and 3.4% in 2016. I hardly say that the growth rates are going like gangbusters. If anything, they're sluggish, but they're growing. And when you're growing at a slow economy pace, you're usually just keeping pace in terms of what's going on in your economy in terms of growing it domestically and with exports, but you're also only gradually growing that workforce because you don't need the capacity because you're not going at all firing at all cylinders. The other thing I did here is to show you the growth rates, and I overlaid the growth rates with exports because exports is what drives Canada. So what I did is I went out to several different sites that gave me the growth rates projections. And the other thing is it also relates to comments that were made earlier to me on several blogs. Why is Canada the only country in recession for the first half of 2015? Well, Canada is dependent on exports. Now, we can be driven into recession for a couple of reasons. One is low commodity prices. The other thing is low demand for our goods. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that just because Europe doesn't have countries in recession, they could have slow growth. If slow growth's there, that's still going to drive exports. That's the statement that's never clearly made by the opposition party in that, and that's why I wanted to show you that when I kind of looked at the projections, I took an average of around 2% as part of what I factored in the growth projections. The other thing I did is I made some assumptions when I looked at exports, because exports is critical here. Now, there's certain statements that have gone around that said if Canada could add the capacity. Now, that's what's key about if you're going to expand exports. You have to have the ability to move goods to markets. Either that's pipeline, either that's port development, either that's a road system, and as well as cutting down the regulations and streamlining the processes to get mines up and running. When I mean cutting regulations down, I don't mean avoiding environmental assessments, but reducing that period of time to see if you can condense it down to ensure that projects move forward. This particular slide just to show you the assumptions. If we were to grow at 6% each year, we would bring in $33 billion more in export business. Now, for each $1 billion of export, it generates about 5,500 jobs. That means basically if we were able to grow exports by 6.3% a year, we could create close to 200,000 new jobs. And export jobs pay very well, and that's why I use that labor rate zone. You can overlay that information to the labor rates. I've also showed you consumer spending, which also drives how the retail sector operates, from retail stores to restaurants to transportation, all that drives the retail side, to give you an idea its impact on taxation. Now, let's look at the assumption. Stephen Harper made some assumptions that he's going to create the conditions to create 1.3 million jobs. What I did is I focused on 4 areas, which is export driven, which is a big portion of the economy, consumer spending, that's the retail side, construction, that's housing starts as well as infrastructure spending and technical jobs. This gets into startups, this gets into office jobs, gets into engineering jobs, and these jobs typically pay a lot more than the retail sector side. So why did I focus on them? Because these are the key drivers that are going to be the bulk of the jobs. Why I haven't got government there? Well, because a lot of cases governments are cutting back the size of government or putting austerity measures into their policies, whether that means cutting nursing jobs. So I didn't include that number as much because it's hard to tell what's going to happen to those jobs over time. So let's look at things here in general. You really have to contrast two types of plans. Harper has used a low tax process in terms of low tax and focus on trade and exports. Mulcair's plan is more protectionism. It's more about hiking taxation and bringing more regulations in. Now, when you're in a sluggish economy, the last thing an economy needs is a lot of shock. Mulcair seems to think that the economy can handle the shock. It can't. And what companies will do if they're handled with too much shock, they'll claw back foreign direct investment, they'll claw back hiring. If they claw back hiring, then that actually puts pressure on government programs. So Mulcair never talks about that. And you need to ask those questions of why his plan is valid. Justin Trudeau has a narrow focus. Okay, he talks about green technology. It's very important business here. It's $44 billion a year, growing at that compound rate of about 8 to 12%. However, Canada is not just about green technology. We have a huge natural resource sector that's very important, because that money it generates actually goes back into taxation in the form of equalization or other forms of payments that can help support the economy in advanced manufacturing, or go into more funding for green technology in terms of the diversification. That being said, you can't have green technology unless you have raw materials. The bulk of green technology requires is rare metals. And where do we get those rare metals? A bulk of them come from China. So it's nice to say that he wants to develop green technology, but what he's not clear on is how he's going to go about doing it, other than throwing money at it in terms of expanding the Sustainable Development Technology Corporation. He's also going to focus on targeting small businesses that he believes are created as tax shelters. Well, that doesn't help the economy or small business. He's basically targeting and he wants to shut them down. So how's that really going to support the economy? It's not likely going to do that. These businesses still pay taxes, so he's kind of looking at things that hit things. So how can you say you're for business and start going after boutique type of tax cuts, or looking at the avoidance scenarios to kind of close things down, to basically say I'm for business? Now, do we need to clean up some of the Income Tax Act? Yes, we need to modernize pieces of it. But we need to be very tactical in how we do it when we do the assessment. The other point that he makes, he's got no details on infrastructure. It's nice to say I'm going to build culverts. It's nice to say I'm going to build roads. But some of that has to be tactically done to support exports. And Justin Trudeau plan fails to address the export side of business. So my question to you is, when you go out there and listen to the rhetoric about all these job creation, the government does not create jobs. What the government does is create the conditions that jobs will be created in. That's the taxation base, that's the regulations, that's the infrastructure commitment. That's how government creates jobs. The rhetoric about adding more policy or going Agenda 21 does not help an economy. It actually takes you 2 steps backwards, and it does little in terms of emissions. So if you're really going to ask yourself when you vote, stop listening to what Unifor and United Steelworkers of these unions say. They have no clue what's going on in terms of how an economy operates. Also, you need to ask yourself, how is Trudeau's plan that has a good portion of that money that's tied into social engineering going to benefit the economy? It's not. What you have to ask yourself, who has the most clear and succinct plan that will create the conditions and support job creation? The only plan that does that is Stephen Harper.